develop mobile applications? Should you do a mobile website? Should you do an application? Should you do your own? Should you buy an app from the vendor? I'm going to talk about that. Should we just use apps provided by incumbent tools? So what do I mean by that? If you have SharePoint already, or if you have IBM connections already, should you just use the app that the vendor has already developed? And then finally, how do you align everything that's happening off your mobile devices with what's happening on your mobile device, right? And how do you align the architecture, the user experience, and make them coordinated, really? So those are the four questions I'm going to address. Are these questions that many of you have? Some of you have? I see some nodding. Okay. Well, these are the top four questions we tend to get about mobile. So there's really two different aspects to mobile content today. One is, I'm an enterprise content publisher. Maybe I'm an internet champion, or I'm in corporate communications, or I own the internet, and I need to publish to a mobile device. That's the first thing. So I have employees out in the field, and I need to make sure they can get the information that they need. The second is, I'm a manager of mobile content, and I want to actually use my content management system or manage my content on my mobile device. So it's a little different. Right, it's two sides of the same coin. So one is I'm just using my internet on my mobile device I'm reading. The other is I'm the person in charge of going into a content management system or a collaboration tool and actually putting it in there and then pushing it out. So there's two aspects there. I'm going to talk about both. One is I'm the enterprise content publisher. How am I going to get my content out to people who have a mobile device? Am I going to do it with a website? Am I going to give them a full web experience, or am I going to do a special mobile version of my website? Am I going to send them SMS messages, for example, something tailored to a mobile device? Or am I going to do it through applications like Facebook, like Twitter? Are you going to have a company application yourself that you might develop that is specifically for your employees to get content? So these are the things you have to ask yourself. Then there's the content manager who says, I want to manage content on my own device. I want to be able to view, create. I want to edit something that somebody else has done. I want to approve content, publish it, delete it, archive it, and actually use a content management system. And these are the approaches, and I'll show you some examples. So let's talk about devices first. Someone mentioned, the gentleman from PwC, one of the things I understood that he said was bring your own device, the idea of bringing your own device. So that's one approach, absolutely. The old school approach 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, I remember the first mobile device that a company gave me was a BlackBerry before the BlackBerry was a phone, right? It was just something to read email. And that was the first push. Everyone in the company gets a BlackBerry, or everyone in the company gets a Nokia, whatever it might have been at the time. But now the more recent approach is bring your own device. And this is where enterprises have very specific challenges. Because if somebody's bringing an iPhone and someone's bringing a mobile Windows phone and someone's bringing an Android, you're going to have very, very different challenges as a company to make sure they all get their content. Enterprise apps, of course, they require security, provisioning, management, and integration with other things. And even if you say, well, we're just going to tell people to bring an iPhone, or an iPad, or something from the school of I, as I sometimes say, you still don't have necessarily consistency across the board. You have variation within even a single family of devices. So you can have, I still have an iPhone 3. I'm sorry, I'm ashamed, but I still have an iPhone 3. I also carry a 3 or 4-year-old Nokia. Those of you who travel, I'm sure many of you have 2 or 3 phones like I do. You might have people with an iPad. And then you actually have very different sorts of experiences on those devices, even if they're all made by Apple. You also might have even more. The more global a company you are, the more you might think about these different operating systems, like Android, like Windows, perhaps a little bit less Symbian these days, and perhaps a little less BlackBerry. It really depends on whether maybe 5 years ago your company standardized on BlackBerries, which is a big challenge that I still have in the UK. A lot of the work I do in the UK, many big companies still, they all have BlackBerries. But they're changing to a bring your own device policy. So thinking about what operating systems you're going to target. We also now have phablets. Everyone know what a phablet? Phablet is half phone, half tablet, like the iPad mini. These small, kind of between the two devices. And if you compare them, you have very different experiences. So you need to account for these things. You need to identify the range of devices. That's the first thing. Okay? What are your users likely to use? And then prioritize your effort based on what those devices are. So even if you have a BYOD policy, if you're an advertising company with a lot of creative people who do art and advertising, you probably want to target more the Mac side of the fence. If you are perhaps an insurance company, you might have different sorts of user base. You might have more Android users. Depending on the geographies that you're targeting, you might choose differently. So prioritize those, and then decide how are you going to adapt your assets. And how are you going to adapt your content specifically for each different device that you're going to prioritize, and also the operating system. So here's an example. A lot of times we don't like to talk about these sorts of phones, right? Because you say, well, that's a small phone, it's an old phone, no one has those anymore, which is very silly. Those of us who work in IT, we might all have our 400 euro or 400 Swiss franc phones, but a lot of the world doesn't, and probably a lot of your customers don't. And so you need to think about what is the experience going to look like on maybe a phone that's 5 or 10 years old, especially if you're selling products in growing markets, India, China. They're generally not using as many of those. A lot of them are still using these. And think about how are you going to adapt different sizes, different formats. And this was perfect to kick off today, the granular content components. You can't build an experience like this if you have lots of big, long content. It doesn't work. So the idea of the content pieces and the snackable content that you can break up, that's how you're going to adapt. Question 2. So you've got your devices picked that you're going to target. You know what operating systems you're going to pick. Question 2 is how are you going to execute on it now? Are you going to do it with mobile websites, or are you going to build applications? Apps are cool. People like to download apps. It's very trendy right now, but it's not necessarily the best choice. So I'm going to show you a few examples of browser-based versus downloadable. The nice thing, of course, about a downloadable app is it's native, and generally you have a better experience. People love apps because they're targeted exactly for what the task is or whatever you need to do. Here's an example of a image management application on the iPad. So in this case, someone is managing an image library. It's like an intranet image library. And they're able to pick a bunch of images and drag them into a directory and give it some metadata. They're able to preview a video and watch the video and use the what's called the motion actions or the stroke actions that you wouldn't be able to do if you were on a normal computer. And you can type and you can add some metadata. And this is somebody who's really managing content on an iPad. You couldn't do this on an iPhone. It's too small. It's way too small. So thinking about what the experience is and targeting that appropriately. This is happening in Safari. As you might be able to tell, this is not an app. So they specifically chose to do this application in HTML5 because they said, well, this is going to be an experience on the browser regardless of what device someone is on. Some other technology vendors, they choose to develop a native app. Now, OpenText, the last one was called Media Beacon. OpenText, they had all their content management apps, well, several of them with a Flash front end, so they obviously wouldn't work on the iPad. So they developed an app to manage images. And this is their image management app. And it's a native download, and the same principle here. They are watching a video, they're managing images, they're searching for images, previewing, etc. In this case, the vendor was forced to do an app because the web application was written in Flash. So all of the people who had iPads, they couldn't do it, so they chose to go the app route. Here's one more that I'll show you briefly. This is a iPad. It's another app, and it's showing same thing: image searching, image management, and someone is able to annotate and look at a video. And this one's playing QuickTime. And this is all that second scenario, right? You're a content manager, you're an intranet manager, and I'm searching and I'm looking, and this is commonly known as digital asset management, if you're not familiar with that term. But it's all about looking at images, searching for images, and being able to do that on mobile is extremely important. Here's some examples. Here's SharePoint as an example. Lots of people have SharePoint here, probably? Lots of hands, of course. OK, had to talk about SharePoint. So here's 3 examples of SharePoint on a Windows-based phone. I think this is the Lumia from Nokia. And what you have here is 3 different ways of approaching SharePoint on a mobile device. Classic, this is the old, HTML look when we used to just simply mobilize things. But here's a more contemporary look. And here's a full screen UI where it's much more modern and slick looking. And these are different ways that Microsoft is already previewing these sorts of experiences in Windows Mobile for 2013, which will soon be coming at us. Some other examples here. If you go browser, so those were apps. If you go browser, it's a little bit different in the sense that you have to take your content that you're already managing for a larger website, and you have to figure out how it's going to be framed in a mobile experience. So usually, you're accessing your website from the same browser that you do on the desktop. So for instance, on your iPhone, you'd be running Safari. On a Windows phone, you'd be running Internet Explorer. And that makes it actually a little bit easier. There's usually lower development costs, and you don't have to keep an app up to date. You're simply doing different rendering on the mobile device. So some would say this is a better approach, but most would say that a native app is more usable, depending on how your user experience design is approached. And you can see here, this is the same, you're talking about the same software here, and it's just generally a better native experience. So that's a decision you'll have to make as well. Here's one more example. If you do choose to go native, you'll have a few challenges. You have to develop separate code for separate platforms. So if you say, I'm going to do apps, you have to write one for iOS, you have to write one for Android, depending on what phones you're supporting. You're going to have to support that. Or your vendor's going to have to support it, and you're going to have to pay them. Or you're going to have to be maintaining multiple applications. So generally, higher cost on this route, but in some ways, higher customer or user satisfaction. Another approach is hybrid. For any of you who use Twitter, Facebook on mobile devices, those are hybrid apps. So it's basically using web technology and wrapping it in something that feels and looks like an app. But it's using web protocols. So you can take advantage of some native capabilities. You can integrate, for instance, with something like a camera. So when you're in Facebook and it says take a picture, that's because it's wrapped in the capabilities and it's integrated, but it's still using the web protocols. So that's an approach as well. So as you think about, okay, what should I do here? If you say, well, I'm just going to go mobile browser, I'm not going to bother with all these apps, versus I'm going to do a completely native app all the way on the other end, and then there's some hybrid wrapper, or you can cross-compile some things from an app and some things from a web experience. There's pros and cons. You can support a wider user base if you have a web, browser based. You don't have to think, well, this is Android, this is iOS. You say it's browser based. It's generally easier to develop and maintain. As I mentioned, it's a little lower cost. But as you go to the other end and you have really strong apps, you generally have a better user experience and performance as well. Okay. So you need to select what's best for you. Again, the same conclusion as question number 1. You have to pick which devices you want to target, and then you have to pick your combination of approaches based on your development team, based on the skill set you have, or based on what vendor you want to work with. Maybe you want to specialize in Android, Windows, because that's what your partner does. You need to make those decisions appropriately and target use cases appropriately. Question 3. Should I use incumbent tools or new ones? So incumbent tool is the one that the vendor has for you, versus should you do your own? Here's 2 examples. A few people have mentioned IBM Connections today, I think. Here's Alfresco. another content management system, open source, commercial open source content management system. And you can see here, they offer tools. So maybe you already have a content management system from one of these vendors or SharePoint. They all will sell you a very specific application that you can run on your mobile device. And they can make that part of your licensing package, no problem. They'll all provide that to you, and it's very convenient because you don't have to code anything yourself, or you don't have to hire somebody to code something. You can use your resources elsewhere, and these apps will generally, depending on the vendor, usually be moderately cross-platform. Some of them tend to favor Android or Windows. Of course, if it's a Microsoft app, they're not going to enthusiastically say, you know, put it all on your iPhones, but it gives you an idea. What's the issue? This may seem great. You say, well, I already have IBM connections. Why shouldn't I just use their app instead of doing something different? The challenge is, if you have a BYOD policy, for example, there's no guarantee that that particular vendor will support the particular devices that your users have or want to use. They're generally hard to extend and customize. That's not saying that you should customize them, but if you do want to customize them, it's going to be very challenging to do so with an app. It's easier to do with a web application. It might not meet your security requirements. That's a huge one that I hear a lot. Doesn't meet our mobile, security requirements. And integration with other apps tends to be pretty tricky. These apps, especially from large vendors like IBM, they tend to be pretty centered on themselves, not really integrating with other things on your mobile device. So you can say, okay, I can start with that. I can run the native app. But where we start to see problems is when you get past the very simplistic scenarios. So if you have very simple collaboration needs on a mobile device, or you have very simple sorts of experiences that you want to have on a mobile device, that's fine. But if you get into more complex scenarios where you want to support 3 or 4 different platforms, or you're supporting thousands of users all over the world in multiple languages, you might have to start doing a lot of customization yourself. So that's part of making that decision. I'm on question 4. I'll keep going. You're welcome to, anyone who has a question while I'm talking, please raise your hand. Okay, almost there. Finally, how do you align the experience that people have on a mobile device along with the experience that they have at their desktop? So as an example, if I'm a content manager and I'm at my computer and it's 5:30 and I check out a document, and that document is checked out, and then I have to leave, and I had put it on my desktop, and then I'm on the train and I think, oh, I wanted to work on that document at home, but it's checked out on my desktop, and I have my iPad, and I want to work on it on my iPad while I'm on the train. How do you reconcile that experience? And syncing up the fact that I'm the same person, even though I checked it out on my computer, I want to now check it out on my iPad. How do you coordinate that? These sorts of scenarios can be very difficult to address. The repository. So the repository, the place you're keeping the information, whether a person's on a mobile device or in their office, wherever they are, it needs to be the same body of content. It should not be duplicated. It should not be replicated. When we first developed mobile websites, oftentimes it was duplicated and replicated. And then fortunately now with content management systems and centralization, we can have one body of content. But that's still a challenge that I sometimes see. In-context editing is another thing. So if you're using a content management system and you're used to being able to log into a website and maybe click on something and be able to edit it in the page itself, that's very hard to do on a mobile device. So making sure that those experiences are coordinated as well can be very challenging. So as you think about mobile, don't think about it in a vacuum. Think about it in terms of the whole experience of the content. And I mean that from both sides. There's the content manager who's managing the content. There's also the consumer of the content. If it's your intranet, it's your employees. If it's your consumers, if it's external, it's them. And you need to make sure that you know, okay, they're on this device right now, but then they're going to go home and maybe finish the purchase on their computer or their laptop. That's all one experience. So as we think about things like content strategy, think about, okay, maybe at this part of the game they're using this device, and this part of the game they're using another device, and map all that out. So that's the answers to the 4 questions. Just in summary, and then we can have a discussion. Identifying and prioritizing needs. So that's in terms of device, in terms of app versus web, in terms of the content and how you want to distribute it, and in terms of how you're going to coordinate the mobile as well as the non-mobile experience. One size does not fit all. So I talked about a lot of different situations where you're going to have people who need to accomplish the same task, not just on a mobile device, but also on maybe 3 different mobile devices and their desktop. So remember that it's just not one solution. You can use tools from your vendor for very simple scenarios, but as soon as you start to tailor it to specific needs, you're probably going to need to do some customization. You said this, mobile isn't standalone. Don't neglect your existing websites, right? Don't just think, okay, we're going to do this on the mobile. Think about what you already have and how you can mobilize it. And remember that in complex enterprises, security and administration is a lot of overhead. It's a lot of work to do this. It's something that a lot of people who are selling technology won't tell you that. They'll put you a very, very pretty, very nice-looking demonstration up on the screen, and it'll look very good. But to actually mobilize your content, to take a content management system and do a mobile website or to develop an app is a lot of work, and it's consistently a lot of work. It's not a one-time project. It's something that takes a lot over time. So keep that in mind. And that's what I had to share today. There's my email address. I'm getting a train at 6:10, so if we don't get to talk today, please feel free to send me an email. I am in this time zone about half the time. And I also invite you to visit our website. You can download a sample of our research and ask and send questions to analysts. And please read our blog. And I'm very happy to answer questions. Thoughts?
Thank you. So there's not one solution for the mobile question.
Of course not. Otherwise, we would all have the same phone.
So, but also for the strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Ich mach das gleich. But also for the strategy, how we integrate it in our content strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So there's also, depending on the solutions we got for the content management and then approach, is there any hint you could advise maybe by industries that strategy is better for content or for data-related information? Is there some kind of direction, or is there, well, it's always specifically driven by the project?
I think in general, with very large enterprises, it's very hard to get into the business of developing custom apps. I generally think taking the mobile applications that your vendor offers and starting there is going to get you probably 80% of what you need. Smaller enterprises that can be more agile and can maybe have just a little bit more variability in their different technology approaches sometimes, because there's not necessarily a fixed standard. Can be a little bit, maybe they can target more devices. But when you're talking about 6,000, some of the enterprises here, 6,000, 8,000 people, economies of scale play into it much more, I think. So.
This morning in the other track, we also talked about the responsive design approach.
Yeah.
Where we're not specifically anymore addressing one device, specific device and one template. Would this be an approach to better align with the mobile challenges?
Absolutely, yes. And I should have used that term, really. This image where we talk about the adaptability, same content, different, this is a form of responsive design, really, where usually when we talk about responsive design, it's not on such a small phone, but that's exactly it. If you're thinking about the different devices and thinking about the experience, that's exactly what we're talking about here.